Here we are going beyond the conclusions of creative evolution. Then, we wanted to keep as close as possible to facts. We stated nothing that could not in time be confirmed by the tests of biology. Pending that confirmation, we had obtained results which the philosophical method, as we understand it, justified us in holding to be true. Here, we are in the field of probabilities alone. But we cannot reiterate too often that philosophic certainty admits of degrees, that it calls for intuition as well as reason, and that if intuition, backed up by science, is to be extended, such extension can be made only by mystical intuition. Granted, the existence of a creative energy, which is love, and which desires to produce from itself beings worthy to be loved, it might indeed sow space with worlds whose materiality, as the opposite of divine spirituality, would simply express the distinction between being created and creating, between the multifarious notes strung like pearls of a symphony and the indivisible emotion from which they sprang. In each of these worlds, vital impetus and raw matter might thus be complementary aspects of creation. Life, owing to the matter it traverses, its subdivision into distinct beings, and the potentialities it bears within it, being mingled as much as the spatiality of the matter which displays them permits. This interpenetration has not been possible on our planet. Everything conduces to the idea that whatever matter could be secured here for the embodiment of life was ill-adapted to favor life's impetus. The original impulsion, therefore, split into divergent lines of evolutionary progress instead of remaining undivided to the end. Even along the line on which the essential of the impulsion traveled, it ended by exhausting its effect. Or rather, the movement which started as straight ended as circular. In that circle, humanity, the terminal point, revolves. Such was our conclusion. In order to carry it further, otherwise than by mere guesswork, we should simply have to follow the lead of the mystic, that current of life which traverses matter and which accounts for its existence, we simply took for granted. As for humanity, which stands at the extremity of the main line, we did not ask whether it had any purpose but itself. Now, this twofold question is contained in the very answer given to it by the mystical intuition. Beings have been called into existence who are destined to love and to be loved, since creative energy is to be defined as love. Distinct from God, who is this energy itself, they could spring into being only in a universe, and therefore the universe sprang into being. In that portion of the universe which is our planet, probably in our whole planetary system, such beings, in order to appear, have had to be wrought into a species, and this species involved a multitude of other species which led up to it, or sustained it, or else formed a residue. It may be that in other systems, there are only individuals radically differentiated, assuming them to be multifarious and mortal. And maybe these creatures, too, were shaped at a single stroke, so as to be complete from the start. On Earth, in any case, the species which accounts for the existence of all others is only partially itself. It would never for an instant have thought of becoming completely itself. If certain representatives of it had not succeeded, by an individual effort added to the general work of life, in breaking through the resistance put up by the instrument, in triumphing over materiality. In a word, in getting back to God. These men are the mystics. They have blazed a trail along which other men may pass. They have, by this very act, shown to the philosopher the whence and the whither of life. People are never tired of saying that man is but a minute speck on the face of the earth a speck in the universe. Yet even physically, man is far from merely occupying the tiny space allotted to him, and with which Pascal himself was content when he condemned the, quote, thinking reed to be materially only a reed. For if our body is the matter to which our consciousness applies itself, it is coextensive with our consciousness. It comprises all we perceive. It reaches to the stars. But this vast body is changing continually, sometimes radically, at the slightest shifting of one part of itself, which is at its center and occupies a small fraction of space. This inner and central body, relatively invariable, is ever present. It is not merely present, it is operative. It is through this body, and through it alone, that we can move other parts of the large body. And since action is what matters, since it is an understood thing that we are present where we act, the habit has grown of limiting consciousness to the small body and ignoring the vast one. The habit appears, moreover, to be justified by science, which holds outward perception to be an epiphenomena of corresponding intercerebral processes, so that all we perceive of the large body is regarded as being a mere phantom externalized by the smaller one, which we have previously exposed the illusion contained in this theory in Chapter 1 of Matter and Memory. If the surface of our organized small body, organized precisely with a view to immediate action, is the seat of all our actual movements, our huge organic body is the seat of our potential or theoretically possible actions. The perceptive centers of the brain, being the pioneers that prepare the way for subsequent action and plan them from within, everything happens as though our external perceptions were built up by our brain and launched by it into space. But the truth is quite different, and we are really present in everything we perceive, although through ever-varying parts of ourselves, which are the abode of no more than potential actions. Let us take matters from this angle, and we shall cease to say, even of our body, that it is lost in the immensity of the universe. It is true that when people speak of the littleness of man and the immensity of the universe, they are thinking of the complexity of the latter quite as much as of its size. A person appears as something simple. The material world is of a complexity that defies imagination. Even the tiniest visible particle of matter is a world in itself. How then can we believe that the latter exists only for the sake of the former? We can and must. For when we find ourselves confronted with parts which we can go on counting without ever coming to an end, it may be that the whole is simple and that we are looking at it from the wrong point of view. Move your hand from one point to another. To you who perceive it from the inside, this is an indivisible movement. But I who perceive it from the outside, with my attention centered on the line followed, I say to myself that your arm has had to cover the first part of the interval, then the half of the second half, then the half of what is left, and so on. I could go on for millions of centuries and never finish the enumeration of the acts into which, in my eyes, the movement you feel to be indivisible is split up. Thus, the gesture which calls into being the human species, or to use more general terms, the object of love for the Creator, might well require conditions which require other conditions, and so on endlessly to infinity. We cannot think of this multiplicity without bewilderment. Yet it is but the reverse of something indivisible. It is true that the infinite numbers into which we decompose a gesture of the hand are purely virtual, necessarily determined in their virtualness by the reality of the gesture, whereas the component parts of the universe and the parts of these parts are realities. When they are living beings, they possess a spontaneity which may even attain to free activity. Hence, we are not affirming that the relation between the complex and the simple is the same in both cases. We only wanted to show by the comparison that complexity, even when unlimited, is no proof of importance, and that an existence that is simple may postulate a chain of conditions which never ends. Such then will be our conclusion, attributing the place we do to man and the significance that we do to life. It may well appear optimistic. The vision at once rises before us of all the sufferings with which life is fraught, from the lowest stage of consciousness up to man. It would be no use for us to contend that among animals this suffering is by no means as great as people think, without going so far as the Cartesian theory of animal machine. We may assume that pain is much diminished for beings possessing no active memory, who do not protract their past into the present, and who are not complete personalities. Their consciousness is of a symbolistic nature. Neither their pleasure nor their pain produces the same deep and enduring reverberation as ours. Do we count as real the pain we feel in a dream? Even in man, is not physical distress often due to imprudence or carelessness, or to over-refined taste or artificial needs? As for moral distress, it is as often as not our own fault, and in any case, it would not be so acute if we had not exasperated our sensibility to the point of making it morbid. Our pain is indefinitely protracted and multiplied by brooding over it. In a word, it would be easy to add a few paragraphs to the theodicy of Leibniz, but we have not the slightest inclination to do so. The philosopher may indulge in speculations of this kind in the solitude of his study, but what is he going to think about it in the presence of a mother who has just watched the passing of her child? No, suffering is a terrible reality, and it is mere unwarranted optimism to define evil a priori, even reduced to what it actually is, as a lesser good. But there is an empirical optimism which consists simply in noting two facts. First, that humanity finds life, on the whole, good, since it clings to it, and then that there is an unmixed joy lying beyond pleasure and pain, which is the final stage of the mystic soul. In this twofold sense, and from both points of view, optimism must be admitted without any necessity for the philosopher to plead the cause of God. It will be said, of course, that if life is good on the whole, yet it would have been better without suffering, that suffering cannot have been willed by God, by a God of love. But there is nothing to prove that suffering was willed. We have pointed out that what, looked at from one side, appears as infinite multiplicity of things, of which suffering is indeed one, may look from another side like an indivisible act, so that the elimination of one part would mean doing away with the whole. Now, it will be suggested that the whole might have been different, and such that pain had no place in it. Therefore, that life, even if it is good, could have been better, and that the conclusions will be drawn that if a principle really exists, and if that principle is love, it is not omnipotent, and it is therefore not God. But that is just the question. What exactly does omnipotent mean? We have shown that the idea of nothing is tantamount to the idea of a square circle, that it vanished under analysis, leaving only an empty word behind it. In fine, that it is a pseudo-idea. May not the same apply to the idea of everything? If this name is given not only to the sum total of the real, but also to the totality of the possible, I can, at a stretch, represent something in my mind when I hear of the sum total of existing things. But in the sum total of the non-existent, I can see nothing but a string of words. So that here again, the objection is based on a pseudo-idea, a verbal entity. But we can go further still. The objection arises from a whole series of arguments implying a radical defect of method. A certain representation is built up a priori, and it is taken for granted that this is the idea of God. From thence are deduced the characteristics that the world ought to show. And if the world does not actually show them, we are told that God does not exist. Now, who can fail to see that if philosophy is the work of experience and reasoning, it must follow just the reverse method. Question experience to what it has to teach us of a being who transcends tangible reality as he transcends human consciousness, and so appreciated the nature of God by reasoning on the facts supplied by experience. The nature of God will thus appear in the very reasons we have for believing in his existence. We shall no longer try to deduce his existence or non-existence from an arbitrary conception of his nature. Let agreement be reached on this point, and there will be no objection to talking about divine omnipotence. We find such expressions used by these very mystics to whom we turn for experience of the divine. They obviously mean by this an energy to which no limit can be assigned, and the power of creating and loving which surpass all imagination. They certainly do not evoke a closed concept, still less a definition of God, such as might enable us to conclude that the world is like or what it should be like. The same method applies to all problems of afterlife. It is possible with Plato to lay down a priori a definition of the soul as a thing incapable of decomposition because it is simple, incorruptible, because it is indivisible, immortal by virtue of its essence. This leads, by a process of deduction, to the idea of souls falling into time, and thence to that of a return to eternity. But what is to be the answer to those who deny the existence of the soul thus defined? And how could the problems touching a real soul, its real origin, its real fate, be resolved in accordance with reality, or even posited in terms of reality, when one has merely been speculating upon a possibility baseless conception of the soul, or at very best, defining conventionally the meaning of the word which society has inscribed on a slice of reality set apart from the convenience of conversation? The affirmation remains as sterile as the definition was arbitrary. The Platonic conception has not helped our knowledge of the soul by a single step, for all that it has been meditated upon for 2,000 years. It was as complete and final as that of the triangle, and for the same reasons. How can we help seeing, however, that if there really is a problem of the soul, it must be posited in terms of experience, and in terms of experience, it must be progressively and always partially solved. We shall not revert to this subject, which we have dealt with elsewhere. Let us merely recall that the observation by our senses of our consciousness of normal facts and morbid states reveals to us the inadequacy of the physiological explanation of memory, the impossibility of attributing the preservation of recollections to the brain, and, on the other hand, the possibility of following up step by step the successive expansions of memory from the point where it contracts to allow the passage only of what is strictly necessary to the present action, up to the furthest plane where it spreads out a panorama of the whole indestructible past. We said metaphorically that we were proceeding thus only from the summit to the base of the cone. It is only at this topmost point that the cone fits into matter. As soon as we leave the apex, we enter into a new realm. What is it? Let us call it the spirit. Or again, if you will, let us refer to the soul. But in that case, bear in mind that we are remodeling language and getting the word to encompass a series of experiences instead of an arbitrary definition. This experiential searching will suggest the possibility and even probability of the survival of the soul, since even here below we shall have observed something of its independence of the body. Indeed, we shall have almost felt it. This will be only one aspect of that independence. We still remain perfectly informed of the conditions of the afterlife, and especially regarding its duration. It is for a time or for all eternity, but we shall at least have found something upon which experience can get a grip, and one indisputable affirmation will be made possible, as well as a future advance of our knowledge. So much for what we might call the experience on the lower plane. Let us now betake ourselves to the higher plane. We shall find an experience of another type, mystic intuition. And this is presumably a participation in the divine essence. Now, do these two experiences meet? Can the afterlife, which is apparently assumed to our soul by the simple fact that, even here below, a great part of this activity is independent of the body, be identical with that of the life into which, even here below, certain privileged souls insert themselves? Only a prolongation and a profound investigation of these two experiences will tell us. The problem must remain open. Still, it is something to have obtained on the essential points a probability which is capable of being transformed into a certainty. And for the rest, for the knowledge of the soul and of its destiny, the possibility of endless progress. It is true that at first this way out of the difficulty will satisfy neither of the two schools, which do battle over the a priori definition of the soul, categorically asserting or denying. Those who deny, because they refuse to set up as a reality what is perhaps a baseless construction of the mind, will stick to their negation in the very teeth of the experience put before them, believing that they are still dealing with the same thing. Those who affirm will have nothing but contempt for ideas which are admittedly provisional and calling for improvement. They will see in them nothing more than their own thesis, impaired and impoverished. It will take them some time to understand that their thesis had been extracted just as it stands from current language. Society doubtless follows certain suggestions of inner experience when it talks of the soul, but it has made up this word, like all the others, for its own convenience. It has applied it to something distinct from the body. The more radical the distinction, the better the word answers its purpose. Now, it cannot be more radical than when the qualities of the soul are taken to be purely and simple negations of this matter. Such is the idea that the philosopher has received only too often, ready-made from society through language. It appears to represent the same spirituality just because it goes to the very end of something. But this something is only negation. There is nothing to be extracted from nothingness. The knowledge of such a soul is, of course, incapable of extension. Nay, it rings hollow at the first blow of an opposing philosophy. How much better to turn back to the vague suggestions of consciousness from which we started, to delve into them and follow them up till they reach a clear intuition. Such is the method we recommend. Once again, we will not please either side. To apply it to the risk getting caught between the bark and the tree, but no matter, the bark will split if the wood of the old tree swells with a new flow of sap.